More recording.
We are recording.
Good morning. I'll open the meeting for the Clatsop County Planning Commission, Tuesday, September 12th, 2023, a regular meeting. Sorry we're a little late this morning, starting the meeting at about 10:15 our time. I ask the clerk to make a roll call, please. Present? Present. I'm here. Thank you. I ask we all rise for a salute to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for one nation under God, indivisible, with I think everybody's had a chance to look at the agenda, so I'd like to ask for a motion to adopt the agenda as presented or with amendment.
I move that we adopt the agenda as presented.
I'll second.
Been moved and seconded to adopt the agenda as presented. All those in favor, please signify with an aye vote.
Aye.
Aye.
Didn't really hear everybody on that. If there are any nays, please so state. I think we've adopted the agenda as presented, and at this point in the meeting, I'll ask if there's any business from the public. Has anybody notified the Community Development Department of a wish to make a statement in the public comment? Okay.
No, Chair.
And I don't see anybody in the audience here, so we'll presume then that there's no business from the public this morning.
Chair? I see that under question and answer, we have 4 people who have questions. Could we address those really fast and make sure we don't?
Okay, sure. Well, how we...
Testing, can someone hear me?
This is Katie Pritchard. I can hear you.
Thank you.
We hear you, Katie.
Thank you.
Okay, we're having...
You guys have Jeremy?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Hear you, Jeremy.
We've had a few little minor difficulties getting off the ground here this morning, but we're ready to go on at this point to the second agenda item, public hearing. This is a legislative hearing regarding Ordinance 2313, amendments to the Land and Water Development and Use Code to allow storage structures for emergency supplies as a Type 1 permitted use in 25 zones. So first I'll ask if any of the commissioners have a conflict of interest in this matter. And I hear none and see none online. I'll just confirm with our clerk whether they have the ability to do the hand raising for so for the 3 commissioners in the virtual attendance, please use the raised hand symbol to get my attention if you have something you want the rest of us to know about. Second point is there anyone, who objects to the jurisdiction of this body to hear this matter at this time? I see no one in the audience again, and, nobody online indicating so. We'll move on, and I ask for the staff report, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Julia Decker, Planning Manager, and I am sitting in this morning for Gail Henriksen, Community Development Director. So this is Ordinance 2313, Storage Structures for Emergency Supplies. And this started a few months back when Clatsop County Emergency Manager Tiffany Brown came into the planning office and asked about what it would take to do some emergency storage structures in some other zones. She was specifically looking at some grant monies that were available. And actually David Cook, who's present right now, was with her up at the counter, and I joined them, and we looked at it and found that we have an ordinance that allows these structures in the F80 and the AF zones, which are resource zones, which are not typically where you have most of the population on a regular basis. And so we thought that it would be nice to have emergency storage structures be an easy use to allow in rural land zones where we actually have populations, where there are actually people, in neighborhoods, for example. So we set about to put some things together, and Gail took this on. Because the F80 and the AF zone actually explicitly call out storage structures for emergency supplies, that implies that they're not allowed in other zones. So we had to add them. And so Gail has provided you with a new definition to add to our ordinance. It's on page 11 of your packet that actually defines emergency and expands it to be things like earthquakes and floods and fires and natural and disasters, things like that. So we have that to add. Let's see what else. One of the things that we noted, while the Oregon Administrative Rule requires the county to apply some of the standards that for public and quasi-public uses that are in the F80 and the AF zone, the resource zones. There's some standards there that are much more rigid than what we had hoped for. So the staff is not proposing to add those standards so that we can actually have something that's a little bit more flexible. So we would be able to allow other local organizations, not just, for example, the county or that kind of an organization, but, for example, a Grange or a homeowners association to actually put in an emergency storage structure on these types of lands. And it would be a type 1 procedure, so it would make it easy. And that's what we're after. Let's see. There's a list there on page 5 of all the different zones, 4 and 5 of all the different zones. And so as you can see, we're looking at places like Cullowbee Lake, Fish Hawk, the Wanna Mill, Surf Pines, all kinds of places where this would become a type 1 procedure. And that's something we can do over the counter. So really that's the meat of it, is we want to add this. It does not seem like it's controversial. We have not received any comments whatsoever. We have the ordinance there for you, and then we have the articles themselves and how they would be revised. Adding storage structure for emergency supplies to all of these different zones. Adding the definition of an emergency. That's the meat of it. I'm available for questions.
Do any of the planning commissioners have questions for staff at this time before we open the public meeting? There'll be time for discussion after we close the public meeting. Okay, I
have questions.
go ahead.
Is there any
We
reference,
probably should state our names or something.
Commissioner Johnson, is there any, notes about size or who might be able to build an emergency structure? Does this apply to any homeowner, landowner? or is this just open to everybody?
This, let's see, I don't believe there's anything that is going to limit the size. Typically, what these are containers. I don't believe we have anything in here that limits size. And this actually does open it up, so that it would be available to, be managed by local community organizations, so houses of worship, other non-governmental entities, to install and maintain facilities in non-forest lands throughout the unincorporated county. So nothing would prevent anyone, even now, from saying, hey, I have a single-family dwelling and I want to put an accessory storage for emergency supplies on my property. Nothing prevents you from doing that now. This is a more organized situation, and this is more geared toward community resilience. And it's something that would be that Tiffany Brown, our emergency manager, is working on. So there's funding through that, through her organization for that. But nothing would prevent you, for example, now from putting such a storage container on your own property.
I have a kind of add-on to that question. So I looked through the packet and I didn't see anything that specified any requirements at all for these kinds of structures that would be similar to the ones that you show for section 3.9220, public and quasi-public uses. And I understand the idea of removing that one item, I believe that item E that you wanted to remove, and open it, be managed by any entity, not just county government, which I think that's a great idea, but I'm wondering, is there nothing to be mirroring these provisions that lay out the grounds for when these are established and how they're established? Nothing at all? It's just...
There's nothing that prevents someone from coming in and making an application. I'm not quite sure.
I'm wondering about the actual structure or container or whatever it is. There's no guidelines on what would be acceptable for that to identify it as an emergency storage facility.
So it's going to it would need to meet all the standards for any kind of a structure in the zone. So it's going to need to meet setbacks, it's going to need to meet height requirements if we're going into a geohazard. But are you saying to label it in some way or identify it?
To identify it, and here's where I'm going with this. It's really probably at this point more appropriate for the discussion point after we open the public meeting, and I'll defer until then, because my question's kind of gone off into a more detailed discussion. I do want to bring that up. As far as questions to explain, I was just trying to find out if there's anything more than what we see in text that we're going to be in county product code to describe these. This is it? This is the totality?
What you see in the text before you is what is proposed.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions from commissioners just on the explanation staff gave during the presentation? Anybody online?
Commissioner Linder, I just have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Okay, if I understand what I read in the discussion I just heard, we're basically allowing emergency storage structures as a acceptable use, but the rest of the requirements in that zone is regarding if there's a limit on the size of the structure or where it can be placed. Those all apply just the same as if you were building any other type of accessory structure. Is that correct?
That is correct. It would still need to meet setbacks. It would still, need to meet all of the sorts of requirements that any structure would need to meet, in whatever particular zone it is. And most of these rural residential zones are fairly similar. So there are front yard setbacks, rear yard setbacks, resource zone setbacks, things like that. So it would still need to meet those requirements.
Thank you.
Anyone else before we move?
Sure. This is Commissioner Johnson. One more question. Is there a reason why we wouldn't just add individuals to that list of name where it says government entities and someone wants to privately manage an emergency storage? I guess it'd be treated as any other building, but.
I suspect that you just said it. It's, if it's on your property, it's your structure, nothing would stop you from doing it now.
I guess what I'm really getting at here is if someone is, for some reason, not allowed to build some type of other structure, someone may decide to call it an emergency shelter, and they're gonna build an emergency shelter. May or may not be used for emergency supplies. 100% for emergency supplies, like you see lots of other buildings that are not exclusive emergency use. I'm wondering if someone may be able to use this rule to be able to do something like that.
Okay, so this is not an emergency shelter. This would be
No,
emergency
it's a supply.
storage.
I mean, I understand that, supplies are.
Right, and so people mislabel what they're doing on the regular. So this is another use that somebody could misuse if they so chose. That does happen. People do, you know, create storage sheds and turn them into, B&Bs or whatever, not B&Bs so much as of short-term rentals. I mean,
Yeah.
we see that there, we don't, I mean, that tends to be complaint-driven, so there isn't anything that's going to, other than the code, and complaints, but if you're gonna, I guess I would say, any kind of structure that is, accessory to the principal use on the property could be misused, could be mislabeled. People do that.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Powers, just, my understanding on the presentation is the reason why this is coming forward is for grant money. Doesn't prevent anybody from building a structure within the permitting process right now to use as emergency. Understand that right?
It's very close. So what this permits then is, the county in this case, but other entities as well, and I'm using the Grange as an example because I see that as a very distinct possibility, but a water district or whatever, to place something for community use on a piece of property that, right now does not have emergency storage as identified as a use. So it allows, for example, emergency management to place a storage container for community use at the Catholic Church property in Arch Cape, for example. Right now, we don't have that ability. We don't have that in our permitting system. We can't do that. But Ms. Brown very much would like a building there. She's got that identified. So that was the one that we were concerned about. We've already got an emergency storage container in the F-80 zone at the Arch Cape Fire Hall, but we were looking at that Catholic church in Arch Cape, and that was one where she had identified, and the church was amenable to the placement. So as we're having the discussion up at the counter about this, we looked at it and said, why don't we have this in other zones? Why don't we have this where there are, you know, communities of people in the RA1 zone, the RA2 zone, the coastal residential zone, the coastal beach residential zone? We have two of those, by the way. Coastal beach residential applies to Surf Pines, for example. The homeowners association then would have the capacity to do something in their zoning. So the idea here was to be able to expand that so that we didn't have this constraint in the zoning ordinance as, hey, you can have emergency storage containers in the F80 and the AF zones. Oh, you can't have them anyplace else. We really strongly felt, and Ms. Brown agreed, we need to have these where they're more accessible to people. And we are not necessarily planning on seeing, you know, thousands of people up in the F80 zone after an emergency. I mean, we won't have the transportation infrastructure.
Okay, does any commissioner have any further questions at this point? I see none and hear none, so at this point, I will call for public testimony, and the hearing is open for public testimony. Failure to raise an issue with sufficient specificity to afford a decision maker and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeal to the board based on that issue. All speakers from the floor are to state their name and address before speaking, and if they're appearing as a representative for an agency or organization, to identify who you represent, and please limit your comments to a reasonable period of time for giving everybody an opportunity to speak. We'll ask if there's any public agencies who wish to speak at this time. There's no one in the audience here, but there may be somebody on the virtual side that wants to speak. I see no indication of that. Is there anyone from the public who wishes to make a statement or comment regarding this matter? Again, I see no one wishing to do so, so there's no need for staff to respond to anything that was given as testimony, and I will close the public hearing at this time and open up the meeting for the planning commissioners to discuss the item before us. We had a little preliminary discussion there that rolled over into somewhat the terrain of what we take up at this point normally in the meeting. So I'll ask if anybody has any further discussion they'd like to toss around amongst the commissioners. I don't see any, but you're welcome to chime in. I have a few questions, some of which have been already addressed, so I will look at my list here. Yes, the main issue I'm trying to get clear in my mind has to do with the identification of the location of these structures and who the structures will serve. And the reason I bring this up is I presume that our emergency management department would be keeping some kind of record of where emergency supplies around the county are being housed and in what form and what kinds of things are there and who has access to them, so that in a time of emergency or before an emergency, we would know whether we're beginning to meet what we expect may be the demand on those kinds of supplies and places to occupy if there was a disaster, required people to move from where they are located normally. So I'm wondering, as far as structures and containers that are put on private property, that's the private property landowner's decision of what to do with it, and they may share it with neighbors. But for these that seem like they're sort of quasi-public, they're going to be set up in other zones, that's perfectly fine, but I think it'll be important for emergency planning to know what the availability of those supplies are and what those supplies consist of. Be very helpful to know whether our county is prepared. Has there been any discussion around that? And this is directed at staff, but I'd also like to hear other commissioners' point of view on this, and I think we have one commissioner that has background in this matter. Just for planning purposes, will the emergency management department keeping a kind of a list of where these things are and matching that against a needs list, whether we're starting to build up sufficient supply?
Well, planning staff cannot answer for emergency management staff. However, I have personally observed Ms. Brown's work, and she keeps a fairly definitive list of spreadsheet, what have you. I mean, this typically is going to be her bailiwick. This is, I believe, what she does. But I cannot speak for her.
Yeah, I understand that. That makes sense. It's just, I don't know how to word it or where it would go, but it just seems like it would be a great provision to have in this somewhere, that there's coordination between people who are trying to do a good thing by having structures and containers that are filled with supplies that'll be very useful to people to recover from a disaster, but we don't really know what we've got. I don't see how we can plan as effectively. So it would just be something that I would think would be appropriate to include in the ordinance, maybe make it voluntary that you could make your facility designated in some way and provide emergency management with sort of an inventory of what's going to be stored and how that would be made available to people in need. Do any other commissioners have
Mr.
a
Chairman,
similar?
Commissioner Powers,
Go ahead.
I would really like to hear her plan. Based upon, we had a previous conversation offline, in the military, we had a lot of emergency shelters, especially rotate stock, inventories, where our supplies were, and how many people we had to serve. I would just like to hear her plan on how she manage these structures or the contents of these structures. If she's anticipating certain things are mandatory for these structures, or is just going to be left to the community that has the structure to determine what. I'm really not in favor of moving forward to adopt this ordinance today, just as a comment. I would rather hear her lay out her plan for the use and thank you.
Commissioner Johnson here. I don't disagree with you, Clark. I don't have a problem with moving forward, just I think it's a good step in the right direction. I think that it would be good to hear her plan and what her proposed use of all of these structures are. But I also see a difference between someone's individual storage facility and a public storage facility. There may be various reasons why people wouldn't want their private stash knowing what they're storing for emergency supplies for their family or whatever they may need. But I would like to hear what the plan is. But from what I see, this is a step in the right direction, and it helps keep things moving for staff. And I'd be okay with seeing things move forward, but with the hope that we could hear what the county's emergency plan is going forward.
Yeah, my comments were not directed at the private community, and if they're using grant money,
Understood.
that's public money.
Would the same, I guess my question back to staff, does the same standard apply to individuals as the public use? And you've said that, well, as an individual, it wouldn't have to be a, emergency storage facility, but it could be any type of storage facility. Would this, is this available to anybody? And it's not limited to those list of people on, page 4, which allows structures managed by local community organizations, houses of worship, or other non-forest lands throughout unincorporated Clatsop County. Does it limit, with what's proposed here, does it limit that to those types of groups, or does it open it up to individuals as well?
This is designed for public and quasi-public, storage, emergency storage facilities. It doesn't limit someone from privately storing emergency materials and emergency supplies. So what's in your garden shed is yours. This has got to do with the public and quasi-public, storage of emergency supplies.
Is it listed in what we're proposing, though, in the new zoning regulations, that it would be limited to those types of things, or? I don't see that as part of the zone regulations. It just, it's opening it up as far as I can tell.
So storage structure for emergency supplies, per ordinance 2313. So the ordinance itself starts on page 7 of your packet.
Right.
So, let's see. I'm looking at the third whereas, law duck limits development of property to uses explicitly listed in the zoning ordinance, and whereas the law duck must be amended to expressly include storage structures for emergency supplies in other zones in order to allow the activity, then they would be looking at the Planning Commission conducting the public hearing and providing a recommendation to, the Board of Commissioners. So basically what we would be doing is allowing emergency storage structures in other zones, and this is, at this time, being driven by the need for public and quasi-public, storage structures. If you would like to hear a presentation from Ms. Brown at a future meeting, maybe, I don't know what her schedule is for October, for example, but if you would like to hear a presentation from her, we'll definitely, get her on the agenda, because this is something that she does very much, enjoy talking about and sharing with the public. And then you can, explore it a little bit further. Can't promise October because I don't know her schedule exactly, but I do know this is, something that she really, really enjoys making, presentations about to community groups. Your commission, I'm sure she would, like to speak with.
Ms. Commissioner Johnson, I'm of the opinion that we could move it forward instead of, I don't know what her presentation would do to sway us. I think, feeling is that many of us agree with it.
This is Commissioner Pritchard. The discussion has been great, and I appreciate everybody's opinions, and I'm leaning towards saying that moving this forward would be better. So at least it's a step in the right direction. And I can't help feeling that part of this is that I feel like we might be stepping out of our wheelhouse somewhat, and some of the things that are emergency services or emergency planning aren't necessarily, in the context of what we're doing today. We're from what I can gather, it is a little confusing as to what all this had meant, but so I would support this in the sense that we want to open up other areas to allow for those emergency storage facilities, with all the different things going on with resiliency dollars and grants and funding that might be open to the public and quasi-public uses. So I don't know. I guess I just, in listening to all the discussion, part of me is like, yeah, I feel like we're kind of stepping outside of our area a little bit. And maybe we're not, but it just seems like that's, yeah, anyway. So, but I appreciate the discussion, and I would probably at this point be of the opinion to move this forward to, get a step in the right direction as well. Thank you.
Right, does Commissioner Linder have anything to add to the discussion at this point?
I don't think I have anything to add that hasn't already been said. I think this is a great idea. I think blurring the lines a little bit between whether it's public or private, I think either way, generally speaking, it's going to be a benefit to the community. And I think we should move forward with it.
You? Yes, my opinion on it is that definitely it sounds like we already have it open for any private party, anybody on private land, have their own emergency supplies, and they can announce that or choose not to friends and neighbors to let them know about those supplies. And that's informal and very important to encourage each person to take that responsibility. But for these what seem to be more organized plans of having supplies available, I feel like this, as written right now, just seems to be missing something to clarify some of the points that Commissioner Powers made, and that I was stammering and stuttering over earlier about trying to track where these facilities are and who would have a right to actually use the provisions that are in those storage places if they were to come upon it and nobody else was there. Can they enter that structure and take what they need? And if public money is going to be used to build these, I think that's really a good thing to do, and do as soon as we possibly can. But I do feel like it would be worth waiting to send this on until there's more detail around how these things are going to be managed and inventoried and sort of quality controlled, as far as, are the supplies being rotated out frequently enough to make them useful in times of a disaster that may be years off. I would hate for us to have a false sense of security based on something that's not adequately overseen in some way, not to try to dictate what to do, but just to keep track of what's there and how much it will meet the demand for emergency preparedness in our county. And I think a lot of this, I don't think this has to be changed much, but I think I'd really like to hear how that's going to be handled and make it more clear in here who has access to these supplies. Unless I've missed something in here addressing those concerns, I would be in favor of probably delaying this, but not delaying it for very long, hopefully not more than a month. So that's my take. Is there anybody else that has a follow-up points they'd like to make at this
I
time?
just see that on the comment on the screen, it says I'm actually going to be speaking about this project. So maybe it would have been helpful to have a presentation beforehand. Can we table it for now, and then I'll allow the president?
You want to make a motion on?
And then we have a presentation, and then back to it?
Hey, I'm sorry, this is Commissioner Pritchard. I'm not sure what's on the screen there. What was it that, a presentation or something somebody mentioned?
we got a message, from Clatsop County Emergency Management that says, I am actually going to be speaking about this project during my presentation. And, that presentation,
Actually ahead of our public hearing, but
Yeah.
maybe we skipped over it.
I don't see that there's a
Yeah,
presentation.
presentation, Clatsop County. Didn't get the revised.
Yeah, I don't
I'm
see that
sorry
either.
about that. I'm apparently,
This is Julia, staff, community development. Is Tiffany Brown on this meeting? Is Tiffany available? Justin Gibbs. Was Justin Gibbs to be speaking today?
Presentation on my agenda.
What was the revised that Julie sent?
Perhaps we could hear from Mr. Gibbs?
Yes.
right, at this point, I want to just clarify something. Unfortunately, it's been pointed out to me that the agenda I'm looking at with my packet, which I picked up on Friday last week, does not show that there's a presentation from emergency management to be given, which was to be before public comments or
It was before the public hearing.
before the public hearing. That
Would've been
was
helpful.
quite important, so.
Well, that might clear some things up.
I take full responsibility for not recognizing that, because I am looking at an agenda that was given to me, but it's incomplete. So I apologize for that, and under the circumstances, this may be highly out of the ordinary, and somebody may complain about it, but I think at this point, I think we could temporarily table this matter and allow the presentation to be given at this point.
Absolutely. Why don't you simply hold the rest of your discussion until after Mr. Gibbs has finished his presentation, and then take it up again.
So hold the hearing.
Hold your vote. No,
Okay.
you've had your hearing. You can hold your vote and ask Mr. Gibbs to give his presentation, and that might go a long ways toward answering some of the questions.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. Did everyone hear that? The idea would be that we'd hold our vote until we hear the presentation, and then we'll jump back to where we just left off, and we'll take up a vote on this matter after the presentation. So if nobody on the commission objects to that, may we please have the presentation from emergency management?
Roan, are you able to unmute Mr. Gibbs? Very
Yes,
good.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'm sorry for the confusion, but I'm very excited to have the opportunity to present to the commission today. When Gail reached out to me, she specifically asked for me to talk about grants and projects that we're currently working on within our department, which I was really excited to talk about because we don't really get to talk about our grant administration as much, and we probably do, a significant portion of the county's grant administration work, and you're kind of discussing a product of that today. So my plan was to talk about the various grant programs that we're currently working on and kind of what our work plans are for those various programs. So I've divided my presentation into 3 segments. So one segment will focus on preparedness grants, which includes the Emergency Management Performance Grant, the State Homeland Security Program grant, which is actually what's going to be funding these cache sites that you're discussing in Arch Cape, and then the State Preparedness and Incident Response Equipment Grant Program. And the next segment is mitigation, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or the BRIC program. And then the final segment that I'll talk about is hazard-specific grant programs. And the two that I'm going to talk about today are the NOAA Climate Resiliency Regional Challenge and the Community Wildfire Defense Grant. So with that, moving into preparedness, the Emergency Management Performance Grant is a grant available through FEMA, the federal government, that provides state, local, tribal, and territorial emergency management agencies with resources required for implementation of the National Preparedness System and to work towards the National Preparedness Goal and secure a resilient nation. The EMPG's allowable costs support efforts to build and sustain core capabilities, the prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery mission areas. So with our application this year, our work plan, one of the primary components of that was updating our emergency operations plan, specifically the base plan component. And we actually started that process a couple of months ago, and have been working with the county departments and county administration to develop the project management plan. And we currently drafted a gap analysis baseline assessment where we've compared or reviewed the current version of our plan against Comprehensive Preparedness Guide 101, which is basically a FEMA guidance document on the components of emergency operations plans to create a national standard. But we've looked at the newly revised document, because our current plan was actually developed based on CPG 101 2012, I believe, and a new iteration was released in 21. So we're looking at, the new industry standards and making sure that we incorporate those in this update process. So with regard to our milestones, our next milestone is the end of this month, and that's to meet with the planning team and finalize that baseline assessment and our data collection plan so we can begin the actual drafting of the base plan. By December 1st, we'll have a final draft of the EOP base plan and implementation guidance, and we'll have that reviewed and approved by the planning team and county manager. And then it's our hope to have that appear before the Board of Commissioners to be promulgated at their meeting in December. Along with, kind of our planning elements within the work plan, we also have laid out a public education and outreach plan, and that includes testing our alert system in the lead up to our readiness fair that's occurring on September the 30th, conduct that readiness fair, and then do another alert test like we did for fire season, do that again in June of next year. So those are the components of our work plan, and that covers the Emergency Management Performance Grant. That's one of the primary kind of revenue offsets for our department, and it's administered differently from state to state. So in Oregon, the state applies, and then we're a sub-applicant Those funds are then divided amongst the various local agencies. The state retains a portion of it, and then the remaining amount is divided. So each county and city that have emergency management programs that qualify for the funding receive a base allocation, and then that allocation is then adjusted upwards. You get supplemental funding based on the population that you serve. And I actually came from North Carolina, where it was administered a little differently. There, you had universal activities that you had to complete, and then you got additional supplemental funding by completing optional activities. And those activities actually are what kind of furthered your emergency management program. So with that summary of the Emergency Management Performance Grant, now I'm moving to the State Homeland Security Program, which is the funding that's we've applied for to support Arch Cape in the development of cache sites. But the Homeland Security Grant Program is a Department of Homeland Security and Federal Emergency Management Agency grant program. Oregon currently receives funding under two Homeland Security Grant Program programs, which is the State Homeland Security Program and the Urban Area Security Initiative. Together, these grants fund a range of activities designed to prepare for, respond to, and recover from acts of terrorism or catastrophic events. I will say that we have to have a terrorism nexus for all of these projects that we submit, and have to have law enforcement support. So the sheriff's office actually provided letters of support for all the various projects that we put forward. So for fiscal year 23, the project submissions, we get a certain amount of funding under allocation. That money is being put towards auxiliary communications, an auxiliary communications trailer that we can use to support incident response if it's, in a remote area where there's not infrastructure, or if infrastructure has been damaged, then we can deploy our OXCOM team to assist with establishing communications. The rest of the projects were actually competitive projects. So we put forward a multi-jurisdictional emergency operations planning project. That project is a collaboration between the county as well as several cities. So the county is looking to have our annexes revised and updated. And that'll go along with our base planning work that we're currently engaged in now. And then there are several cities that also need to update their emergency operations plan. So we're partnering with them and utilizing the county's process as a template or to inform their planning processes. So Cannon Beach, Seaside, and Astoria all need to update their emergency operations plans as well. So we felt like this was a good collaborative effort to ensure that we're, vertically aligning our plans between, the municipalities and the county and the state. So the next project is a fuel node construction. So we actually just recently closed a couple of projects under SHSP. One of those being a grant to procure a fuel tank. So this project we've done in collaboration with Public Works, but one of their goals was to develop fuel systems or nodes outside of the inundation zone. The county's only fueling location is currently located at the Public Works facility, which is in the inundation zone. So we were actually able to secure some funding through SHSP previously for fuel planning, but because of the pandemic, that project was not completed. So we were able to enter a change of scope of work and actually secure some additional funding to purchase a UL 2085 12,000 gallon fuel tank that's located at the new sheriff's office location. This particular project is the second phase of that. So it's actually doing all the site work to install the fuel tank. And then the next project is the project that you've actually been discussing, which is the Arch Cape emergency cash containers and supplies. So this is not a county effort to place cash sites. This actually came forward from the Arch Cape community group, specifically their emergency prep subcommittee. They're actually trying to develop cash sites, much like Cannon Beach has, that will hold mass care supplies. So that they're the ones that identified the sites, and that's when we determined, that there was an issue, a use issue with one of the sites that they had identified. And that this particular project is, since it is kind of a quasi-governmental type entity or a community organization, they're looking to make these supplies available to the entire community of Arch Cape. I went back and looked at their application, which we probably could have provided in support of this request as well. But it says that the project will address the mass care capability of the rural communities to prepare for, protect against, and respond to acts of terrorism by providing life-sustaining and human services to affected population, to include hydration, feeding, sheltering, temporary housing, evacuee support, and distribution of emergency supplies. It also addresses the community resilience capability by empowering the individuals and communities who help prepare the application to make informed risk management decisions to lessen the impacts of an act of terrorism to the community. So really it's around, the community of Arch Cape being an island or cut off, from their normal, logistical supply chain for that community was the focus. And that could either be an act of terrorism or, a natural disaster. Looking through the plan, it looks like they're planning to support, says both Arch Cape and Falcon Cove Beach through volunteer labor and private donations and club support have established a rudimentary emergency cash system to care for 50 people for 3 days. And this particular project is to expand that capability. And it looks like the proposed project will fill the gap by increasing the current 3-day 50-person supply in 2 locations to a 7-day supply for 200 people, is the intention of this particular project. And it also addresses identified gap related to providing community-specific education, outreach, and training So the community has identified a need to customize preparedness and response resources in order to acquaint new residents and visitors with the unique features of the disaster environment in Arch Cape. So there is going to be a training and education program that surrounds this cache site project. And I think to speak specifically to some of the concerns that were voiced earlier about the inventory, the location, since we're applying through as a subrecipient through the state, part of the grant administration, even though this application has been put forward for a community organization, under the requirements of the grant, we're actually required to keep an inventory of everything that's purchased using the funds, and to document the location, because we could potentially be audited as part of this grant program. And part of that audit program includes potential on-site visits. So our office, probably, in conjunction with the community organization, will have to keep detailed records, of what's purchased with the funds, what's going into the container. But with this being a competitive grant, I don't know that there were actual, to the detailed specifics of what they were going to be putting in. I know probably blankets and cots and, food, along with, other supplies to support, people if they were required to, live outdoors after a catastrophic event. So tents, things of that nature. But I will say, if they employ a model like Cannon Beach also made space within their cache sites available. So that way individuals within the community, if they didn't have the space to develop their own cache emergency supply, they could put drums or barrels inside this community facility to be accessed in the event of an emergency. So these could be utilized in that capacity too, for those that, can't meet the requirements for a specific community to have a designated location that they can store their supplies. I believe that addressed a majority of the questions about the project. The next is Cannon Beach Emergency Operations Center tents. That was put forward by the community of Cannon Beach to support, I think, either disaster operations, to set up tents in case they needed to set up disaster operations in a remote area, or the tents could be utilized, in a sheltering mass care capacity as well. And then the final project was from the city of Astoria, that also involves, sheltering equipment, tenting and things of that nature as well. So in total, between all the projects submitted to SHSP, I think we submitted somewhere around, $400,000 in projects. With that, since there is some, I guess, you're considering action around one of the projects that we submitted, are there any more specific questions about that project for the community of Arch Cape?
Any of the commissioners have a question?
Commissioner Powers, not on Arch Cape, but on the whole thing with the ordinance to include Arch Cape. So if this is inappropriate at the time, let me know.
Okay.
As I heard you on the Arch Cape, but I'm trying to apply it to this ordinance in all the areas.
Uh-huh.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Number one is, I think you're telling me that these locations are local use only. They're managed locally by the community involved. You may keep an inventory, or you're required to keep an inventory. You might even have inspections. But when it came to sharing with other communities, is there anything there about if the county decided it needed to use part of Arch Cape or someplace else, is there some use sharing available, or is it strictly restricted to the local community that has the storage structure?
Well, I can say that I think the intention of this supply is to be utilized for anyone that may be in the community at the time an emergency occurs. I mean, it's not, so that could be community members, that could be visitors, that could be, whoever makes their way to that community. If they're cut off and isolated, these supplies are meant to support whatever population that is, in a snapshot at the time. I will say, with Cannon Beach, we have accessed some of the supplies in the past to support other emergency efforts, specifically during the winter of last year. We made a request to the city of Cannon Beach to access some of their blankets to support the warming center operations that were occurring, and they, graciously, made blankets available, for sharing. So I definitely think on a case-by-case basis that there would be availability, to utilize them, any of those supplies outside of the community.
Okay, so be clear, if Napa needed Arch Cape would or could share their asset?
They could. I'm not gonna, commit Arch
Okay,
Cape since.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions for the emergency management presentation?
And I think there was one other question about who could access the supplies within the community. I'm fairly sure if they're employing the same model as Cannon Beach, that that those sites would be secured, and then there would be individuals that are associated with the organization that have access, whether that be, through other volunteer groups. I know that they specifically have trained like their community emergency response team on, how to open the cache sites and deploy, the various supplies within the cache site. So I think it would probably, access would be controlled by the E-Prep and those that they've permitted or trained to access the site.
Okay, well, thank you again for your presentation, and it did give us some answers to some of our questions, I think, and I apologize for overlooking or working from an agenda that didn't have you in the appropriate order. So
yeah, that's no problem. I actually have a little bit more that I was going to go over just about, some of the other grant programs as well. If that's okay with the, okay, thank you. Moving on to the State Preparedness and Incident Response Equipment Grant Program. The SPIRE grant provides equipment to local governments and other recipients for emergency preparedness. The program funds the purchasing and distribution of equipment, including vehicles and other property to be used during an emergency to decrease the risk for loss of life and property. These funds were actually made available through Oregon House Bill 2687, and the program became effective in 2017. During the 2021 legislative session, House Bill 2426 added urban search and rescue equipment to the list that was eligible through this program. And since its inception, Clatsop County has benefited, and the communities in Clatsop County have benefited in a number of different ways from SPIRE. Specifically, Warrenton received a high axle vehicle. Cannon Beach just recently, this is the most recent resource acquisition, received a water purification and desalinization trailer. And then Seaside has received a fuel trailer, portable lighting, and portable power generation. With that, that concludes the preparedness grant programs that we're currently involved in. Moving on to mitigation, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program provides funding to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments so they can develop hazard mitigation plans and rebuild in a way that reduces or mitigates future disaster losses in their communities. This particular grant funding is available after a presidentially declared disaster. In this program, homeowners and businesses cannot apply for a grant. However, a local community may apply for funding on their behalf. So they could apply, through the county or some other entity that has been defined within our natural hazard mitigation plan. All state, local, tribal, and territorial governments must develop and adopt a hazard mitigation plans to receive funding for hazard mitigation project applications. So we've actually been invited to develop an application. The state received funding, and they actually had some applicants, back out of particular projects. So they solicited participation from other local governments, and we put forward several project proposals. One being the elevation of the levee system in the Brownsmead area. The second, to develop a location to store seasonal public works equipment outside the inundation zone. And I think the final was related to the dock facilities that were damaged during last year's winter storms. We are actually going to be putting forward an application by the end of this month to support public works in the development of a location in the Napa or Joel vicinity to store their seasonal equipment. That has a really high cost benefit analysis because of the cost of that equipment. They recently secured approval through the county to purchase the building. The application that we will be putting forward will be to help with the site development and installation. The next grant program is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program. You may be aware of this program through recent media around Columbia Memorial Hospital, but Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities supports states, local communities, tribes, and territories as they undertake hazard mitigation projects, reducing the risk they face from disasters and natural hazards. The BRIC program guiding principles are supporting communities through capability and capacity building, encouraging and enabling innovation, promoting partnerships, and enabling large projects, maintaining flexibility and providing consistency. So as I mentioned earlier, Columbia Memorial Hospital submitted a BRIC application last year to upgrade their facilities to mitigate for tsunami impacts. We just recently, within the past week or so, received notification that they have advanced out of the national competition, and that FEMA will be submitting requests for further information through the Region 10 office, and we will be, assisting in responding to those requests for information, and hopefully we will receive, favorable news that that Columbia Memorial Hospital received the funding they requested in the future. And then the last segment that I'm going to talk about is hazard-specific grant funding. The first program is the NOAA Climate Resiliency Regional Challenge. Approximately $575 million became available for projects that build the resilience of coastal communities to extreme weather and other impacts of climate change, including sea level rise and drought. Funding was made possible through the Inflation Reduction Act, and is going to assist NOAA with advancing their efforts to build climate-ready coasts. The focus of the grant program is on collaborative approaches to achieving resiliency in coastal regions. Proposed projects should address risk reduction, regional collaboration, equity, and building enduring capacity for adaptation. And also available through this program, aside from, construction type projects, NOAA, there's a particular pathway or lane for technical assistance for organizations applying for and receiving, this particular grant. And those options are available to include data, tools, training, and access to NOAA expertise. With that particular grant program, we're actually, Clatsop County is partnering with Land Conservation and Development, and other counties and organizations to form the Columbia River Estuary Flood Adaptation Partnership. And the project that's being put forward aims to build resilience in the Columbia River Estuary in Oregon and Washington by identifying flood impacts related to sea level rise and other flooding sources known as compound flooding. These other sources include, but are not limited to, high tide, storm surge, precipitation events, river flow levels, and land use practices. Climate change is impacting these flood sources through increased storm intensity and larger precipitation events. And as a result, communities along the estuary in Oregon and Washington are experiencing increased flood conditions in new areas and for increased durations. The particular strategies that this project is going to be employing to increase resiliency are data collection and gap analysis, pulling together regional data that is available and determining what data would need to be available to inform future mitigation projects, centralizing the data into a hub that links geography to socioeconomic and environmental data, then conducting a vulnerability assessment using that data, and developing a community engagement plan, prioritizing and coordinating flood mitigation adaptation projects based on the outcomes, of that vulnerability assessment, and then selecting 3 vulnerable areas that are discovered, through this endeavor for in-depth planning to include potential acquisitions or hybrid infrastructure, other types of strategies that we could use to reduce impacts. The final grant program that I'll discuss is the Community Wildfire Defense Grant. This particular program is intended to help at-risk local communities and tribes plan for and reduce risk of wildfire. It was authorized by bipartisan infrastructure law and prioritizes at-risk communities in an area identified as having high or very high wildfire hazard potential, or low income, or have been impacted by a severe disaster that affects the risk of wildfire. The program funding to communities is for two primary purposes: to develop and revise community wildfire protection plans, or to implement projects described in a community wildfire protection plan that's less than 10 years old. Our community wildfire protection plan is somewhat dated. It's over 10 years old. So we plan to apply for this funding to update our community wildfire protection plan. And we have, some challenges in that regard because between the national data and even the data that's, proposed by the fire marshal's office, there are not any areas in Clatsop County that are identified as high risk, but there is some local data in our natural hazard mitigation plan, as well as some other factors like the impacts from winter storms that increase, potential fuels by downing trees and debris. So we're going to try to leverage our natural hazard mitigation plan as well as those other factors to apply for this funding, and the deadline is October 31st. So with that, that completes my presentation on all the various projects and grants that we're currently involved in. Are there any questions for me?
We'll open that up for any questions from planning commissioners to our presenter. Really appreciate you going through all that. It's a lot to absorb in one sitting. Many programs, many different grant possibilities, many different players. So it's almost overwhelming to take in one sitting. It would be great to have had a few pertinent note sheets or something included in our packet that would help jar our memories in the future about these different programs. But I do appreciate the time you've taken with us this morning, and wish I had heard some of this before our public hearing got started.
Yeah, and I actually have a slide deck that I prepared, and I can make that available to Julia and Gail to distribute to the committee members.
That would be very helpful. I'd appreciate that. Any one last shot at questions to our presenter?
No, Commissioner Powers, it answered.
Okay, well then, thanks again, and we'll move back to where we left off in the public hearing on ordinance 2313. And at this point, I don't know if there's any additional discussion, having heard the emergency management presentation. But if not, I'd be, at this point, looking for a motion on whether to approve the amendments as presented, or amend them, or to decline to. from any of the commissioners. Would someone care to make a motion regarding the amendments to ordinance 2313 regarding emergency structures?
This is Commissioner Johnson. I'll make the suggested motion that I recommend the Board of Commissioners approve ordinance 23-13 as presented.
Commissioner Powers, I will second that.
Okay, it's been moved by Commissioner Johnson and seconded by Commissioner Powers to recommend to the Board of Commissioners we approve the revisions to ordinance 2313 as presented in our packet. So at this point, it's open for discussion. Regarding that motion, so if anyone has points they'd like to bring up regarding the motion, please do so now. Seeing none and hearing none, I would at this point ask for a vote, a roll call vote to be taken. So all those in favor, please respond aye when your name is called, or if opposed, say no, and we'll record the vote. You may have a roll call. Aye.
Aye.
If someone's called my name, I can't hear it. So if that's what you're waiting for.
Amy Pritchard,
Aye.
Aye.
Jeremy Leonard,
Aye.
Howard is out.
Right, the ayes have it by 5-2 who aren't present. And the motion passes, and the recommendations will be forwarded to the Board of Commissioners for their approval. Are there any further steps we need to follow on this?
This is Julia Decker, Planning Manager. There are no further steps for you. We can simply move forward with getting that to the Board of Commissioners. I did want to take one quick moment there and remind you or let you know the person from whom you heard that presentation was Clatsop County Emergency Management Director Justin Gibbs. I had mentioned Tiffany Brown earlier. She is the emergency manager. Justin Gibbs is actually the director of that department. I just wanted to make sure you knew.
Thank you for that presentation. A lot of information there that it's nice to know that we're making steps in the right direction, planning for inevitable emergencies.
I agree. Okay, moving on then, we were gonna have a work session. I think we're running up against the clock rapidly here, but I think we could go on with agenda item 4 and have agenda item 3 and have a work session on LADUC Article 3, non-conforming structures and regulations. We had a couple of exhibits in the packet. So I hear from David Cook on this matter, planner with the Community Development Department.
Development. For this presentation, or for this agenda item, staff has prepared the first draft of amendments to LADUC Section 3.1000, which regulates nonconforming uses and structures. A nonconforming use or structure is any use or structure that has been legally permitted, but which does not conform to the current zone regulations. The colloquial term is grandfathered. The existing code language describes the process for expanding nonconforming structures and uses. It is staff's opinion that the permit process for these is arduous. For example, under the current regulations, a nonconforming home, which does not comply with current setback standards, would require a Type 2 conditional use permit to build an addition, even if the addition is outside of their setback area. As another example, and this is one that I worked on for quite some time, in Westport, there's a strip of land along Highway 30 that was rezoned from residential to commercial in around 2005. There's still several homes in this area that were then made non-conforming by the rezoning. Under the existing regulations, one of these homeowners would require a Type 2 conditional use permit to develop even a small shed on their property. The draft code amendments, as are shown in Exhibit A, have been rewritten to reduce the permitting burden for homeowners primarily. The other difficulty with the existing code is that it refers to both non-conforming uses and structures and illegal uses and structures. The current code causes confusion for staff and developers by not being specific enough when referring to non-conforming uses and structures. The proposed code amendments have removed all mention of illegal uses and structures. Since this is a first draft, staff is requesting feedback from your commission. Staff will iterate on the draft amendments based on your comments and return this item at a future public hearing. Thanks.
Thank you for that presentation. I'll open it to discussion, and this isn't very formal, so just chime in with your thoughts on this if you have any. Why don't we first look to those virtual members, if not leave them out in the cold there. If either Commissioner Linder or Commissioner Pritchard have any thoughts on this, please speak up. Seated here, any of the commissioners here?
Powers. I would like to see, but it's not absolutely mandatory, definition of alteration. And I was reading it, but again, I'm not a contractor, I'm not a builder, wasn't sure what alteration was, but I got the sense it's the existing structure and something you would do inside or exterior, but you would not. It was just my sense. Might want to consider.
Thank you, Commissioner. There is a definition of expansion shown in the packet. We did not include a definition for alteration since we are not altering that definition. It's currently in that code area, but we can include it in your next agenda item just for total clarification.
Can you clarify abandonment for me? What does that exactly that mean? It means they're no longer using it as their...
Yeah, correct. Commissioner Johnson, the abandonment item on there is to help the county have some kind of jurisdiction over non-conforming uses which have been abandoned for a number of years, and to prevent them from restarting, 5 or 10 years down the line if they've been abandoned. So that abandonment definition is a new definition in this section, but it was previously under a different regulation of the same section. We've simply moved it to the definition section to sort of make it upfront what abandonment is and what regulations apply to it. So, for instance, another real example, on John Day River Road, there is an older boat storage or vehicle storage facility that has been abandoned for well over a decade, meaning it wasn't operating, nobody was using it, it was left abandoned. And under our current regulations and under the proposed regulations, the property owner or developer or whoever would not be able to simply restart their storage or auto repair or whatever that previous use was because it was abandoned. They would have to go through a permitting process in order to reestablish it.
is it up to who believes it's abandoned? I can see a dispute between landowners sometimes or the county on whether or not they actually abandon their use. But I understand a little more clearly.
Thank you. And for clarification, the code does go into, you know, when we consider something abandoned. I do believe the existing code, which perhaps did not make it into these draft amendment updates because we aren't proposing it to change, goes over the process of what a property owner needs to supply to the Director of Community Development in order to make a determination that a use has been not abandoned. Provide some evidence that the use was still being used if it's not immediately apparent.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of, say someone has a piece of property that has an old house on it that nobody's lived in for a decade. It's now in a commercial, it's been rezoned into a commercial zone, but it's a residence. Now someone comes along and they want to make alterations to that and make it habitable again. Would that be possible, or is that considered abandoned?
Under this code, I think that would still qualify as a residential use. I think that perhaps Gail or Julia could provide a better answer, but simply not living in a home is not something we would generally consider abandoned. We're thinking more of like businesses that are completely out of operation. They've moved somewhere else, and now you just vacant land, abandoned of any actual use. Does that make sense, Julia?
It does, and I can add a little bit more to that regarding, for example, a residence or a dwelling that is not in use. We typically are going to be looking for a specific set of, a list, if you will, a punch list. And that's going to be, does it have power, or does it have water? Does it have a septic system that's functioning, or at least was acceptable at the time that it was first developed, which for some of these older structures can be a little rustic? Is it on the assessor's ad valorem taxes for the last 5 years? And so if it meets this list of criteria that are not in front of you right now, because we're not proposing to change those, then we would consider it a continuing use.
Yeah, I kind of had a question around that too. First, on page 18 of our packet under continuance, section 3.1030, item 2B mentions nonconforming use has continued without abandonment or interruption for the 10-year period immediately preceding the date of application, et cetera, et cetera. How does that compare to on page 19 of our packet, section 3.1040, abandonment or interruption of use, that has the 1-year time frame? Are those related, or are these two different things? I had trouble making sense out of a lot of this. It was it's condensed down, I understand, and that's helpful because who wants to read a whole bunch? But it does lead to a few questions.
Yeah, Chair Farrar, the continuance section, subsection 2, it gives an avenue. It requires a type 1 procedure for a property owner to demonstrate that, if they want to prove that their use has been continued, they need to provide evidence that it has not been abandoned or interrupted for the previous 10 years prior to the date of any time they make an application, a development application, or to the date that the ordinance changed, which prohibited the use. And then abandonment is simply, it was abandoned for more than 365 days.
I still find that a little confusing, but I'll let it go for now. Just in general, under the continuance item, and this is more a question out of curiosity, under 2 there where you talk about type 1 procedure, to apply to verify nonconforming use, and then it lists what you need to demonstrate. what would be the reason somebody would be actually making an application to verify a non-conforming use? Is that done in preparation to do something else, or is that just something they want on the record, and why would that be?
Yeah, correct, Chair. So if somebody wants to, going back to this abandoned auto storage or auto repair shop on John Day River Road, if they wanted to prove to us that it was not abandoned, then they would go through this type 1 permit procedure and supply the necessary information.
And if that was accepted, then they could just go forward without any further applications?
Exactly, then they are
Okay.
a continuing use, a continuing non-conforming use.
And then it seems like a lot of this stuff is, the requirements A through E there, it's kind of, not exactly clear how you would provide that evidence. Certainly tax records might help, but, is this commonly done, and is it something that most people find, they can come up with enough evidence, photographs, or what, testimony of neighbors, or what kind of?
Yeah, Chair Farrar, we don't see it often with things like commercial uses or industrial uses, because those don't often become abandoned or near abandoned, and then they have, ample evidence to supply with those. Normally those just keep going. We have seen it for things like old dwellings that have been destroyed in like resource zones, and somebody wants to rebuild the home, they need to prove that a home was legally there at some point in the past, historically. So I think the code here is purposefully leaving out certain documentation as a requirement, because we could accept a large variety of things. We could accept written testimony from a neighbor, we could accept photographic evidence, we could accept old historic aerial imagery, we could accept tax documents. We purposefully leave it open so it's up to our discretion on when somebody has provided evidence, rather than requiring them to provide a specific item.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. I have one final point, and it's actually the one that I had the most concern about. It's hard for me to state it in a real simple way, but under the replacement and damage section on packet page 20, non-conforming structures and uses, when a building is entirely destroyed or heavily damaged by fire or other natural disaster, it seems as though it's being allowed to reconstruct that structure in conformance with the dimensional standards of the building prior to its destruction. So does that mean that if an older building that isn't built to current code standards burned down, say my house, which is one such building, it's way different than the way a building would be built today. If it burned down and then I went to my insurance company and wanted it rebuilt, would they just tell me under this provision that they can just pay to have it rebuilt the old way? Or would they be required to build the building up to current code standards?
Chair Farrar, this code section only talks about the dimensional standards of your home if it were destroyed and is non-conforming to setback or building height. It is allowed to be rebuilt in the location that it was with the same dimensions that it had.
Okay, so
But
I
not
guess
talking about Oregon State Building Code standards, which you don't have jurisdiction over and absolutely have updated every single year,
Yeah. So I guess I was just confused by what the term dimensional standards meant, but that is just the, more or less the footprint of the structure.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
where it resides on a particular property in terms of setbacks. Okay, that's clear enough for me. I have no further questions. Would there be any other questions?
Just a quick one based upon what you just said. Is this whole thing about dimensional standards?
I'm sorry?
Is the whole exhibit that you've given us about dimensional standards, or was just?
Thank you. Commissioner Powers, the dimensional standards are really most important for the replacement and damage section. They kind of touch on it in the continuance section as well. You can continue, you know, the operation and the same level of use that was previously there.
I have a couple more questions.
Go ahead,
Mike.
Commissioner.
There's a couple different places where it refers to the real market value. Why do we have to be concerned about what the real market value may or may not be of a structure that's being replaced? And also, there's a fourth spot in here where it talks about you need to have a permit within 1 year of the date of the damage, and I'm concerned that may be too short of a time frame. Sometimes it takes a bit of time to get insurance things settled and different things worked out before you get an actual building permit to start work on something like this.
Thank you. Commissioner Johnson, on the comment of real market value, real market value is what our code currently asks for determining what the loss of value is in the event that a structure is damaged either by, you know, the property owner or by some other, you know, like a natural disaster. It's a very objective way of determining what the damage is to a structure so that it's more, it's easier to, you know, approve a permit for the rebuild of it if you know what the official real market value is for the project, rather than it being very subjective. Like if we based it solely on like building square footage. So for instance, in the replacement and damage, under subsection 1B, it talks about if a structure is damaged by the property owner or their agent to an extent amounting to 75% or more of its real market value. Real market value there is very important to understand that we have an objective determination of what the damage is, and it's not, you know, 75% of the square footage of, you know, the first floor or all floors combined, or 75% of the value of outlying buildings, things like that.
This is Julia. I just wanted to jump in. If you'll take a look at D underneath, it also allows staff to look at the real market value shown as determined by records of the county assessor, or, and this frequently comes up because it sometimes is more useful, the value can be determined by an independent licensed appraiser. And that sometimes is more useful because sometimes assessor records undervalue. So certainly an appraiser, a licensed professional appraiser, can be used.
So, in section C there, it says, to the extent amounting to less than 75% of its real market value, a building permit for its reconstruction shall be obtained within 1 year of the date of the damage. So if it's less than 75% of the value, this wouldn't apply?
Oh,
It has to be like a complete destruction almost, more than 75%? Am I reading that right?
Sure, yeah, so subsection B and C are both referring to when a structure is damaged through the fault of the property owner or through their agent, not a natural disaster. Subsection C says, well, if the real market value, if the damages are less than 75% of the real market value of your previously existing structure, then you can rebuild it to the, I think we even say dimensional standards here. We don't say dimensional standards in there. But you can receive a building permit for its reconstruction in 1 year of the date of the damage. If it's over 75%, then the then the structure needs to come into conformance with the ordinance. And that's to prevent the odd case where somebody wants to, build a new home in a specific area, and they, I'm
just
thinking
thinking-
insurance fraud situations where they burn down their
I'm
own
just thinking
house.
that someone's house, is non-conforming, it's within a setback, it burns to the ground, so it's over 75% of the value.
Mhm.
They would not be able to, under this, they would not be able to rebuild in its current location, in its current footprint.
Correct, if the fire was caused by the property owner and not like a wildfire or other kind of natural fire.
A gas explosion, is that,
Yeah, I guess that's.
is that property owner's problem?
Arson, I don't think a property.
That's a
damage.
great
Yeah,
question.
with arson,
And I
but-
wonder if we define natural disasters anywhere in
Yeah.
our code.
I guess that's what I'm getting at. Is that necessary to have that in there? Or does it, or do we need to have, someone be able, or is the goal here to try to allow someone to rebuild something that was destroyed, that was no longer, wasn't in a conforming use? To be able to put it back the way that it was? Is that a reasonable thing for someone to be able to do with their property that non-conforming, but it's grandfathered in, been there forever? Is it reasonable for them to be able to rebuild the way that it was? In my view, I think it is. I don't know that we need to, put a 75% threshold on there. I would be comfortable with, with whatever it needs to be,
Yeah.
100%.
Well, Commissioner Johnson, under that subsection, if you look at A, if a non-conforming structure is totally destroyed, if it's destroyed by some kind of natural disaster, they can absolutely rebuild it to its location and to its dimensional standards without concern. If it's destroyed by their actions, however, is where we start to talk about limiting it to 75% of the value.
So typically, their actions are going to be remodeling, sometimes without permits, sometimes with. So sometimes you'll see the county get into some code compliance issues with that. So this provides some structure, but it's not if the wind comes along and blows your mini storage down, for example, you have the ability to rebuild that. It's when somebody actually hires someone or does themselves a tremendous amount of work on a structure that, and sometimes it gets into structures that don't have a lot of value. So this is where that 75% is coming from. But if there's a disaster of some sort, if it's a windstorm, if it's a fire, if it's something like that, that 75% doesn't count.
I guess it's, I kind of feel like if someone has something grandfathered in, that they should be able to maintain their property. If it's destroyed, they should be able to fix it. Not that you should be able to expand on it necessarily if it's not, if it's built within a setback, but there are structures all over the county that are non-conforming, that,
Oh, yeah.
built before zoning regulation came into place, before certain setbacks came into place. That I don't want to make, I want to make it as easy as possible for someone to replace or maintain, and without having to go through, type 2 procedures and make it difficult to put, or conditional use procedures to do what they need to do if there's damage. Less power.
Time to go.
I suppose,
Speaking of emergency management.
yeah. One thing I might say is we perhaps should have included the entire section of code, because
Might answer some of those questions.
it would, because then you would see that someone is permitted, for example, to maintain a non-conforming structure and do the work necessary to keep it in good repair and safe and out of code compliance. So, for example, you can replace your roof, you can do the plumbing upgrades that are necessary to bring it into code. Those things, are permitted.
Okay, I think, for next time, it'd be nice to see a red line, you know, draft, you're taking, this is a work session, you're just taking in our comments and listen to what we have to say about it, but if we saw, you know, a red line version of the proposed, you know, what the latest and greatest would be nice to see.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner Johnson. At the public hearing, we'll definitely have to strike out underlined.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can see the
So-
whole thing.
So as I understand it, it's not that the person, if you look at item C again on, packet page 21, the non-conforming structures damaged over 75%. It's not that they won't be able to rebuild, they'll just have to conform to current standards, is that correct?
That's
So-
correct, Chair.
I don't have a problem with that. At some point, you gotta update stuff and, to just allow people to build back way out of conformance.
Well,
At some point, you gotta draw the line, I think.
when it means conform, wouldn't that mean moving the building out of the, like I said? I mean, you couldn't put it back into a non-conforming use by encroaching in a setback, so it'd potentially make it so it's not possible for you to rebuild if it has to conform,
Well,
referring to a setback.
that's an interesting point. If it's, I mean, would there be a variance possibility because you're supposed to allow people to use their land if this non-conforming structure was damaged to the point where it needed to be replaced, and they had to bring it into conformance, but that conformance would make it impossible for them to fit it on the land, would there be an option for a variance there?
Chair Farrar, yeah, I mean, somebody's welcome to apply for a variance. One of the standards for a variance is that your hardship is not self-imposed. So
Yeah.
if you destroy your own structure willfully or accidentally, that's kind of the poster child of self-imposed.
Uh-huh.
If your commission would like to explore opportunities to make it simpler or easier in these uncommon situations where a property owner destroys their own structure and cannot feasibly rebuild without, even if they come into conform, or I should say that there's no possible way for their rebuild to come into conformance with the code, staff can look at adding a possibility of a section that, sort of rewriting this section. If there's anything we can do, we'd have to confirm it with state land use regulations as well,
Yeah.
but.
Maybe some options there to explore, just.
There may be, but, you know, on the other hand, at some point, it's time to move on from, the Stone Age into the modern world, so I don't have a problem at some point of kind of requiring people to bring things up to standard.
So I'm just gonna chip in my 2 cents. Couple concerns that I have, and maybe they'll be clarified if we were to see the whole code, but as far as the rebuilding portion, whether it's, you know, a tear down or destroyed by the owner or whatever it is, the setback issue or whatever is one thing, but I'm thinking more in terms of if you have a property that is currently non-conforming because of a zone change, like the example that I think was provided earlier, and that was your family home. I would want to make sure that if that home was destroyed or, you know, was at the age where, you know, it needed very significant repair or rebuilt, that it would, you know, a person would not be restricted from being able to do that. And I'm not totally clear if that is the case or not. I'm also a little bit concerned about the 75%. I mean, I don't know how to, I mean, I know there's got to be a cap somewhere, but I've run into this in another scenario, and it caused a lot of unnecessary grief. And then I also would agree with the point that one of the points Commissioner Johnson made about the 12-month window or the 1-year window to get a building permit. I think that needs a little bit of more flexibility there, just given the times that we're in.
Commissioner Linder, thank you. Yeah, staff can look at extending the 1-year time limit to obtain a building permit. I do think that given the rising cost of building materials and the lack of certified contractors, it can be tougher to get a building permit within 1 year, especially if all of your possessions are destroyed. As to a home, a residential home in, like a current commercial zone, this code is not designed to prohibit the maintenance or the repairs of that structure. The structure would still fall under the replacement and damages subsections 1A, B, and, 1 through E, or A through E, excuse me, of the replacement and damages section. So if it's destroyed by a natural disaster, it can still be rebuilt to its previous dimensional standards. If it's destroyed by the property owner in an amount less than 75% of the real market value, it can be rebuilt to its previous standards, dimensional standards and location. If it's destroyed by the owner in an amount exceeding 75%, as the code is currently proposed, it would need to come into conformance.
Thank you.
This is Commissioner Pritchard. Not to beat a dead horse, but I do want to go on record that my biggest heartburn with this section, not so much the at fault or not at fault, but the in regards to damage done by natural disaster or whatnot. But it really, the heartburn I have is that 1 year time period as well. And I know you've taken note of that, but I just want to make sure that I on record as stating so also. Thank you.
Any further comments for Planner Cook? Well, I think that was helpful discussion and certainly agreement around extending that permit time a little bit and some good clarifications there. So we'll look forward to seeing the revisions and at a later meeting. Any idea when that might be?
Chair Farrar, I might check what the Planning Commission agenda timeline is, what other kind of things you guys already have slated, but 2 months sounds reasonable.
Sounds good.
Seems like it.
I see the clock now has struck a little past 12:15. We started 15 minutes late, so we're only 2 hours into the meeting. I was just going to suggest that to finish going through this packet, we all had a chance to see the project status report, which is pretty self-explanatory. Unless anybody's dying to ask a question about that, I would suggest that we have a chance just for a kind of compressed version of the director's report, if we could. Julia Decker?
Everybody's ready? Certainly. I will give you a compressed version, however, of the project status report, just because every now and then somebody asks, and that is regarding the Arch Cape Deli. Staff has been contacted by a representative of the owner about reconfiguring that additional use permit a little bit. They are looking at changing a few things, changing the footprint of the building, changing some of the uses within the building. So currently, we're working to prepare some sort of a punch list to show them how far they can go with changing that before it becomes a new conditional use permit, because remember, they are vested for what they had. And there were all kinds of elements to that. There were ingress, egress, the footprint, the uses, the parking, hours of operation, all that sort of thing. So now there are some changes being proposed, and so, anyway, staff is working to figure out how far they can change it before it becomes a new permit. So, just so you know, that's out there. So, let's see.
You're
what
right,
else.
that is one we always kind of look at,
You
wonder
always
about.
kind of look at it, and so I just wanted to make sure you had that information, because it's percolating.
Any idea when the board might look at the community plans?
The community plans, oh,
Been about a year, so I'm just kind of curious if, when it might
Staff
fall on
is
their
still-
agenda.
staff is returning to the community plans later this month, and producing some new materials. Not exactly, I don't have the
Okay.
planning commission list. I didn't think to bring that, I apologize. But staff is returning to it later this month. Let's see, so comprehensive plan update. We've moved into this whole goal 16, 17, thing that we're working on at the staff level. We have, as you see there, two proposals that were received, for the economic opportunities analysis. They are, awarding that to Johnson Economics, and, so anyway, the work on that is supposed to be completed in about a year. Also, we have, two requests out and have received two responses for comprehensive plan goals 16 and 17, and also 18. And in both cases, received, proposals from CREST and then another group, Sea and Shore Solutions. We had requested more information from both those entities. We've got the, responses back, but we have not had time to go through them. Director's out of the office, obviously, so we'll get back to that, probably next week to review that. So we are moving forward with goals 16, 17, and 18, and that whole, contract award. Let's see. The one that's probably gathered some of your attention is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project. They have, in the last very short period of time, submitted 5 different projects to the county, one of which, is not consistent with the coastal zone plan, and staff has indicated it is not. So, we've been working with Department of Land Conservation and Development staff and coastal zone management staff to indicate what the issues are with that. And so you see then, in the final couple of pages of your packet, a letter, from the governor's office that copies basically, U.S. senators and congressional representatives explaining, the issues that we have with the Corps apparently planning to dredge in a conservation area. And staff cannot sign off on that, being consistent with our comprehensive plan, without amending our comprehensive plan, and without taking goal exceptions, and without all of the extensive work that goes into that, which means, studies, very large, expensive studies, which the Corps presumably would be doing because they're going to do this anyway. But we haven't seen it. Nothing has been submitted to us. We have nothing in the way of, any materials to be able to update the dredge material management plan and add a new site to it, or anything that suggests that putting it in this one spoils area in, this conservation area would be consistent. So that's kind of where we are there.
Can you tell me where this is at, where they're proposing dredging and where the fill area is?
There are a number of spots, but the one that we're at odds with them with is River Mile 38.4, I think.
Okay.
Don't hold me to the point.
I won't hold you to that, I was just wondering, it's in the river, in the main river
It's in
out
the main
there.
stem, yes, correct.
And the fill area is somewhere out there as well?
Well, they have, that would be like a stockpile area. They're calling it temporary stockpile, but it's kind of temporary permanent. And, so the dredging would actually be in the, navigation channel. It's where they want to put the spoils that's a problem. Because they would be placing it into, a conservation area. And there are a lot of conservation areas up and down the river on both sides. I mean, at this point, I mean, if you were to look at our old goal 1617, you would see a number of areas that, include, for example, a Dungeness crab nursery out, between some of the islands. Staff doesn't know if those things are still there because those were, inventoried in the 70s. We don't know what's out there. We don't have any new information, and we don't have a pot of money to go out and do those studies ourselves, so we would require the applicant, and the Corps doesn't have to apply for anything because they're the Corps. So anyway, it's not consistent with the county's comprehensive plan, and staff isn't going to sign something that says it's consistent if it's not.
Do you happen to know whether they went ahead? It sounded like they were intent on doing this, the Corps is the they, were intending to go forward with it and start in the last couple days of August. Have they actually continued doing this work?
They said they were going to, then they stopped. I mean, this changes day by day.
Huh.
So, I haven't gone out and the edge of the dock and looked.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's, a dramatic court case unfolding there.
Perhaps, yes, it's certainly a strong letter.
Yeah.
So let's see what else we have. The, Regional Housing Task Force did not meet in August. Staff will be presenting information on proposed zoning, codes amendments to the Board of Commissioners at a work session in October. That would be Gail doing that, not I. Let's see, NOAA Climate Resilience Regional Challenge Grant. So on August 28th, the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force, in conjunction with the county and other jurisdictions, submitted a letter of intent to NOAA to apply for $2 million in grant funding. The proposed project would collect regional data on compound flooding and sea level rise and its impacts on dikes and levees in Clatsop, Pacific, and Wahkiakum counties. Let's see what else. Farm and Forest Improvements Project. Ian Sisson, our senior planner, is serving on a state technical working group for the Farm Forest Conservation Program Improvements Project. There's an explanation there of what they are doing. I just want to add to one thing to what's being said there, and that is Ian was requested. Farm Forest Specialist Hillary Foote has seen his work, which has been presented to you and to the board as well, and Ian was requested. So that's it.
I'm very proud for Ian. He's a great person to have on the staff, and doesn't surprise me that he's been called on for special duty. Any further questions from any of the commissioners before we move to the last item on the agenda? Good of the order, I have one quick one. You know, there've been some procedural issues that have come up in our meetings, and I think everybody received an email from one of our commissioners a few weeks ago regarding that fact that we hadn't really followed the correct procedure in a meeting before we took a vote. And rather than go through the details of that, I just want to encourage all the commissioners to not hesitate to call attention to something that may seem out of order or inappropriate by making a point of order, and we'll consider it when you do. And in doing so, you may save everybody a lot of time by just catching something that that we yeah, that we should have caught right during the meeting and be able to finish business at that meeting in an appropriate way. So, sorry the other commissioners can't hear it, but I hope everybody will
I
chime
can hear
in.
you.
Okay, like today, you know, where I was looking at an agenda that had left out the presentation, you know, feel free to chime in if I skip over something that's on the agenda you're looking at. It wasn't on mine, it still isn't on mine, but, that'll just keep us on an even keel, and I need all the help I can get from all of you, so thank you very much for your patience. And, if anybody else has anything? No? Tired? Okay, it was only 2 hours and 13 minutes long, so I'll call the meeting ending now at
Thank you, guys.
12:28.
Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
See ya. It's quite a strong word letter.
Yeah.